Welcome to Slack Signal X. Today, the mythos of the great slacker. There was a time when doing nothing was an art form. It wasn't laziness. It was real, studied, deliberate inaction. It was like a Zen surrender to the absolute absurdity of all of this. And if any generation perfected it, it was us. But before we do this, you know the drill. Like, subscribe. But most of all, don't be a poser. We were the kids who watched the world burn from the back of the room, arms crossed, too cool to care, too smart to believe in the hustle. We were born into an economy that didn't even want us. We were raised by parents who, a lot of the time, just forgot us. We were spoon-fed this culture that promised us greatness, only to hand us temp jobs and debt. So we said, screw it. We embraced the drift. Some called us slackers. We just called it freedom. But that word slacker, it was always misunderstood. It wasn't about being lazy. It was about opting out. It was about rejecting the rat race before it even started. And like any good rebellion, it had its own philosophy, its own icons. It even had its own soundtrack. This is the story of slackers, our roots, our ethos, and why, in a world that demands productivity at every second, our legacy still matters. 1. The origins of slack. Before there was a word for it, before the media turned it into a punchline, slacking was just a way of life. It was the beatniks in smoky cafes, the dropouts thumbing their noses at the establishment, long-haired burnouts who realized that working yourself to death just to afford a house with a white picket fence wasn't their dream. It was a total scam. But for us, slacking wasn't just rebellion. It was a survival tactic. We were the first generation to grow up in the wreckage of the American dream. Born into recession, raised on latchkey loneliness, coming of age in a world where our parents' jobs were shipped overseas and our own careers, if we even wanted one, were looking more and more like an endless rotation of dead-end gigs. So we adapted. We found value in detachment. We leaned into the absolute absurdity of all of it. Some of us checked out completely, grabbing backpacks, disappearing into a dive bar in New Orleans, taking odd jobs just to keep the lights on in a shoebox apartment. Others lingered in coffee shops, flipping through tattered copies of On the Road, trying to figure out if there was a way to exist without selling a piece of ourselves. Slacking wasn't about doing nothing. It was about doing nothing for them. And no one captured that ethos better than the Church of the SubGenius. Let's talk about that. Part 2. The Church of the SubGenius. If slacker culture had a sacred text, it was written in the late 70s by a bunch of weirdos who worshipped a grinning, pipe-smoking salesman named J.R. Bob Dobbs. The Church of the SubGenius wasn't a religion, not really. It was an inside joke turned cosmic philosophy, a middle finger to every televangelist and self-help guru who ever promised enlightenment for a price. The core tenet? Slack, of course. Not just doing nothing, but the right kind of nothing. The holy art of avoiding soul-sucking labor and carving out space for our own weird, beautiful, meaningless existences. We weren't aimless. We were enlightened. We knew the system was a joke, so we laughed at it and moved on. It was punk rock, but funnier. It was nihilism, but somehow uplifting. It was a big cosmic shrug at the nonsense of modern life. And for those of us who found it, it made perfect sense. Part 3. Slacker Jazz. You could call it the soundtrack of detachment. Slacker culture had a sound. And no, it wasn't just grunge. There was something about jazz, specifically the loose, meandering, we'll get there when we get there flow of slacker jazz that spoke to this whole philosophy. Artists like Soul Coughing, Medeski, Martin and Wood, and the Lounge Lizards, they weren't trying to impress anyone. The music was casual, improvisational, the sound of a band just vibing, just existing. You could hear it in other bands like Steely Dan. Those guys were the definition of detached cool, spending years crafting albums that sound effortless. And then there were the lo-fi hip-hop producers decades later who took that same energy and vibe and made it into background noise for a whole new generation of kids who wanted to tune out. Slacker jazz, it wasn't flashy. It wasn't in a hurry. It just was. Part 4. The slacker film movement. Richard Linklater and the Art of Wandering. No one captured slacker culture on film better than Richard. His 1991 film Slacker was basically a manifesto. No plot, no heroes, just a meandering, dreamlike walk through Austin, Texas, where conspiracy theorists, anarchists, and dropouts drifted in and out of frame, lost in their own bizarre, fascinating conversations. It was a movie about us, people who didn't fit into the system and didn't want to. Then came Dazed and Confused, Clerks, Reality Bites. Movies where characters talked more than they acted, where big existential questions got asked in gas stations and record stores, where the ultimate goal was to avoid selling out. Slacker cinema didn't preach. It didn't try to inspire. It just existed, like a guy hanging out on his porch, watching the world go by. Part 5. Zen and the Art of Not Giving a Damn. Here's the thing. Slacker culture wasn't just rebellion against capitalism. It had real spiritual undertones. Buddhism teaches non-attachment. The idea that clinging, whether to money, success, or even identity, only leads to suffering. Instead, you had to learn to accept, to flow, and exist without fighting the current. That's slacker culture in a nutshell. It's why so many of our icons were drawn to Eastern philosophy. I mean, Kurt Cobain had a Buddhist altar in his home. Keanu Reeves, the patron saint of chill, has spent his entire life quoting Zen koans in interviews. The dude from The Big Lebowski? Basically a stone bodhisattva. Slacking, at its purest form, it wasn't about being lazy. It was about letting go. Why does slacking still matter? I don't know, but maybe, just maybe, it's time for a comeback. Because in this world that never stops, where every second of your day is supposed to be optimized for productivity, where burnout is a badge of honor and hustle culture is treated like a religion, slacking would be more radical than ever right now. Not laziness, not apathy, but real slack. The kind that gives you space to breathe, to think, to exist out of someone else's expectations. Maybe we had it right all along. Maybe the greatest act of rebellion isn't working harder. Maybe it's just opting out. And maybe, just maybe, the world needs a little more slack. Thanks again. Like, subscribe, and please don't be a poser.